She watched him choose another mate, so she walked away with his greatest rival Alpha. Naomi Carter did not cry when she saw them together. She stood at the far end of the hotel corridor, her fingers wrapped around a glass of sparkling water, her body completely still, and she watched. That was the part no one ever talked about afterward, not the betrayal itself, but the watching. The moment when the truth stops being a suspicion and becomes something you cannot take back. Something you have seen with your own eyes, in a room full of people who have no idea your entire world just rearranged itself without making a single sound. She had been together with Derek Hale for 3 years. 3 years of weekend trips and shared grocery lists and building a life that looked, from every outside angle, like the kind of life people worked hard to have. Derek was 34, confident in the way that made people stop and listen when he talked, the kind of man who walked into rooms and shifted the energy without trying. He was in finance, senior level, respected in his industry, and he had a smile that could make you feel like the only person worth talking to in a crowded place. For a long time, Naomi had believed that smile belonged to her. She was 31. She worked in brand strategy for a mid-size marketing firm, and she was good at her job in the quiet, competent way that rarely got celebrated out loud. She was not loud. She did not demand attention. She had always believed that real love did not need performance, that the people who truly cared for each other showed it in the small, private moments. She had held on to that belief the way you hold on to something when the air around you starts to get cold and you are not yet ready to admit that the temperature has changed. The company retreat had been Derek's idea. A 4-day event at a mountain hotel, his firm's annual gathering, where senior staff brought their partners. Naomi had rearranged 2 client presentations and canceled a Friday meeting to be there. She had told herself it was important to show up for him. She had always shown up for him. The first evening had been pleasant enough. They had dinner with 2 other couples, and Derek had been warm and funny and attentive in the way she remembered from the early months of their relationship. She had gone to bed that first night thinking she had been overthinking things. That maybe the distance she had been feeling between them for the past few months was just the natural settling of a long relationship, not the beginning of something worse. But on the second evening, everything shifted. She noticed him leaning toward Simone at the welcome dinner. Simone Clark was a new hire at Derek's firm, 27 years old, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having been told to quiet herself down. She laughed at the right moments and made everyone around her feel included, and Naomi had initially thought she seemed like a genuinely lovely person. Then she watched Derek refill Simone's glass before anyone else's. Watched him turn toward her mid-sentence when someone else was speaking. Watched his posture open in a way it had not opened toward Naomi in a very long time. Naomi told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was reading too much into a dinner conversation. She had always been too observant, too attuned to things that other people missed. It was a habit that had served her well professionally and caused her pain personally. On the third evening, she could not sleep. Derek had said he was going to grab a drink at the bar with a few colleagues and would be back within the hour. By midnight, he had not returned. Naomi lay in the hotel room and stared at the ceiling and felt something she could not quite name, not anger yet, not grief, but something quiet and precise, like a needle pressing into the center of her chest. She got up. She put on her shoes. She told herself she was going to get water from the vending machine down the hall. She never made it to the vending machine. She saw them in the lounge, at a corner table away from the bar, just the 2 of them in the low lighting. Derek's jacket was off. Simone was leaning forward, her chin resting in her hand, and she was looking at him the way women look at men they have already decided they want. And Derek was looking back the same way. They were not touching. They did not need to be. Naomi stood there for what felt like a long time but was probably no more than 8 or 9 seconds. Then she turned around and walked back to the room. She did not run. She did not make a sound. She closed the door behind her, sat on the edge of the bed, and breathed. Then she opened her suitcase and began to pack. She moved quietly and methodically. She folded everything the way she always folded things, not rushing, not shaking, just placing each item in the bag as if she were packing for a trip she had planned weeks in advance. She took her toiletries from the bathroom. She picked up the book she had been reading from the nightstand. She took her phone charger from the wall. She did not leave a note. She booked a car to the airport at midnight and sat in the back seat watching the mountain hotel disappear in the rear window. She did not cry in the car either. She looked out the window and watched the dark road pass, and she thought about the version of herself that had believed she was enough, and how that version of herself had slowly, over the course of 3 years, been taught to ask less and expect less and require less. She thought about all the small ways she had made herself smaller. She had turned down a senior director position at another firm 18 months ago because it would have meant relocating 2 hours away, and Derek had not wanted the distance. She had told herself it was a mutual decision. It had not been mutual. He had made clear that the relationship would suffer, and she had believed him, and she had stayed, and she had watched that opportunity pass and told herself she was being a good partner. She thought about the dinner parties she had left early because he was tired. The friends she had drifted from because their schedules never aligned anymore, mostly because Derek preferred evenings at home or outings that he chose. The way she had stopped mentioning certain ambitions because he had a habit of responding with a slight smile that made them feel small. She thought about all of it on that midnight car ride, and she did not feel anger rising. She felt something colder and more clarifying. She felt the particular relief that comes when you finally stop pretending that something is fine. By the time the car reached the airport, Naomi Carter had already begun to change. She sat in the departure lounge and booked the first available flight home. She put her headphones on. She stared at the gate number on the screen and made herself one quiet promise. She was not going to go back to being the woman who reduced herself to fit into someone else's life. Not for Derek. Not for anyone. She did not know yet what came next. But for the first time in 3 years, the question felt like possibility instead of fear. The plane lifted into the dark sky, and she did not look back. Derek called twice the next morning. Then again in the afternoon. By evening, there were 4 text messages, escalating from confused to concerned to quietly defensive. Naomi read all of them. She did not respond to any of them. She was already at work. She had slept 3 hours on the flight home, showered, changed, and walked into her office by 9 in the morning with a coffee in one hand and a calm on her face that her assistant later described as the most focused she had ever seen Naomi look. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and began working through the client presentation she had postponed to attend the retreat. She worked through lunch. When her colleague and close friend, Laura Penn, stopped by her office in the afternoon with a raised eyebrow and the wordless question of someone who knows something has happened, Naomi simply said she had come home early, that she needed some time, and that she would explain everything when she was ready. Laura, who had known Naomi for 6 years and understood her silences better than most, nodded, set a cup of green tea on Naomi's desk, and left without pressing. That was the thing about real friendship. It knew when to ask and when to simply stay. That night, alone in the apartment that still had Derek's gym bag by the front door and his coffee mug on the kitchen shelf, Naomi sat at her dining table and allowed herself to feel what she had been holding at a distance since the corridor of that hotel. It was not the dramatic unraveling she might have expected. There was no crying on the bathroom floor, no desperate reaching for her phone, no impulse to call someone and pour the story out in broken sentences. There was just a long, quiet ache, and underneath it, something harder and more important, a decision. She had spent 3 years investing in someone who had, in the end, been looking elsewhere. That was not something she could fix. That was not something she needed to analyze into the ground or debate with herself for weeks. It had happened. She had seen it. And the woman who had packed her bag in that hotel room at midnight had already made the essential choice. What remained now was everything that came after. She called the recruitment agency that had contacted her 8 months ago about a senior director position. She knew the role was likely filled, but she made the call anyway, because making the call was the point. It was the act of reaching toward her own life instead of away from it. It turned out the position had been filled. But the recruiter, a sharp woman named Claire Dobbs, told her she was glad Naomi had reached out, because there was a new opportunity, a brand director role at a firm that had just expanded, and it was in the city, no relocation required, and the compensation was significantly above what Naomi currently earned. Naomi said she would send her resume within 24 hours. She spent that evening updating it. Not frantically, not with the desperate energy of someone who felt they had nothing, but with the careful attention of someone who had been undervaluing themselves for too long and had decided to stop. Derek arrived at the apartment 3 days after the retreat. He had his key. He let himself in while she was making dinner, and he stood in the kitchen doorway with an expression she recognized, the look of a man who had prepared a version of events and was hoping she would accept it. He said her name. He said he could explain. He said that what she thought she had seen was not what it looked like. Naomi turned down the heat on the stove. She set her spoon on the counter. She looked at him directly, the way she had not allowed herself to look at him in a long time, clearly, without softening anything. She said she did not need an explanation. She said she needed space, and she said it with a steadiness that stopped him mid-sentence. He had expected tears. He had possibly expected a confrontation, an argument, something he could respond to and manage and slowly talk his way back from. He had not expected this, a woman who had already moved through the worst of it without him and arrived somewhere he could not reach. He tried again. He said things that were meant to sound honest but had the careful shape of prepared words. He brought up their time together, their history, the life they had built. He said she was important to him. He said he had made a mistake in judgment and it would not happen again. Naomi listened to all of it. Then she asked him, calmly, to take his gym bag and his coffee mug when he left. He left. She finished making dinner. She ate at her dining table with the window open, listening to the street sounds outside, and she felt no relief and no grief and nothing particularly dramatic. She felt like someone who had just closed a door that had been stuck for a long time, and her hand was a little tired from the effort, but the door was closed now, and the room on the other side of it was finally hers. In the weeks that followed, she moved through her life with a quiet focus that people around her noticed without being able to fully name. She started going back to the Saturday morning yoga class she had stopped attending 2 years ago because Derek had preferred she spend those mornings with him. She accepted an invitation to a dinner party hosted by a former colleague named George Webb, a man she had liked and drifted from during the years of the relationship. She started cooking the recipes she had always wanted to try but had never made because Derek had simple tastes and she had stopped cooking beyond them. She interviewed for the brand director role. The interview lasted 90 minutes and ended with the hiring manager telling her she was exactly the kind of strategic thinker they had been looking for. She was offered the position 4 days later. She accepted without deliberating for even an hour. She also did something she had not done in years. She started sleeping well. Not the restless, half-alert sleep of someone who was always slightly on edge, waiting for the mood in the apartment to shift or for a conversation to go sideways. She slept deeply, in the way you sleep when you are not carrying someone else's emotional weather into the night with you. Laura noticed. She told Naomi, over coffee one Tuesday morning, that she looked different. Not in an obvious way. Just more like herself. Naomi smiled and said she thought that was probably accurate. She had not yet heard from anyone about what was being said in Derek's professional circle. She was not paying attention to that. She was paying attention to her own life, which was quietly, steadily, without any noise or announcement, becoming something she actually wanted to be living. She had no idea that across town, in a glass-walled office on the 14th floor of a building she had never been inside, a man named Marcus Webb had just read her name on a proposal document for the first time, and had stopped, and read it again. The news that Naomi had left the retreat early and that she and Derek were no longer together spread through their professional circle the way these things always did, not in one conversation, but in fragments, in the spaces between other conversations, in the way someone's name stopped being mentioned alongside another person's name without anyone saying why. Derek did not speak publicly about it. He returned to work after the retreat and carried on in the manner of a man determined to outrun the story with his professional presence. Simone Clark continued to work at his firm. Nobody said anything directly about that either, but in the particular ecology of a mid-size professional community, people knew what they knew. Naomi, for her part, said almost nothing. She answered direct questions from people she trusted with brief honesty. Yes, they had ended things. Yes, she was doing well. No, she did not want to go into detail. She was not performing composure. She genuinely had it, which was rarer and more unsettling to some people than drama would have been. She was 3 weeks into her new role as brand director when Marcus Webb's name came into her life directly for the first time. She had, of course, heard the name before. Derek had mentioned Marcus the way rival executives mention each other, with a specific kind of tight-jawed acknowledgement that contains more respect than the speaker intends to show. Marcus Webb ran a competing financial advisory firm, and he had been, by every measurable standard, the more successful of the two men for the past 4 years running. His firm had taken 2 major client accounts from Derek's firm in the past 18 months. His name appeared in industry profiles with adjectives like precise, strategic, and relentlessly effective. Derek had called him calculating, cold, a man who treated business relationships like chess moves. Naomi had heard this and had no particular opinion, because Marcus Webb had been Derek's problem, not hers, and she had not spent time forming views on people who existed only in her partner's professional resentments. Then Claire Dobbs, her recruiter, called her on a Wednesday afternoon to say that Marcus Webb's head of strategy had reached out to inquire whether Naomi might be open to a brand collaboration conversation. Not a job offer, a collaboration between her new firm and his. Naomi's first instinct was mild amusement. Not suspicion, not excitement, just the quiet recognition that life was occasionally willing to be obvious about its ironies. She asked Claire what she knew about the collaboration proposal. Claire said it was straightforward. Marcus Webb's firm was repositioning its public-facing brand and wanted to bring in outside strategic expertise. Naomi's name had come up, apparently more than once, in conversations about who in the industry was doing genuinely interesting brand work. Naomi thought about it for approximately 48 hours. Then she agreed to a preliminary meeting. She dressed carefully that morning, not to impress, but in the deliberate way she had started dressing since taking the new role. A charcoal blazer, clean lines, nothing excessive. She arrived at the meeting 3 minutes early, which was her habit, and she was shown into a conference room on the 14th floor where the view of the city spread out behind the floor-to-ceiling windows like a painting. Marcus Webb came in at exactly the scheduled time. He was taller than she had imagined, though she had not spent much time imagining. He had the kind of face that took a moment to read, not cold, as Derek had suggested, but careful. Considered. He shook her hand and said it was good to meet her and then immediately directed the conversation toward the work, which she appreciated more than she would have admitted. They talked for 90 minutes. He asked her questions about brand positioning that were specific and genuinely curious, not the performative questions of someone making conversation, but the questions of a person who had already thought deeply about a subject and wanted to encounter another perspective. He pushed back twice on points she made, directly but without condescension, and both times the pushback was worth engaging with. She pushed back on him once. He listened, reconsidered visibly, and said she had a point. Just like that, without qualification or ego management. Just, you have a point. She drove back to her office afterward and sat at her desk and did not immediately begin working, which was unusual for her. She sat for a moment with the strange clarity that comes after a conversation that has engaged every part of your thinking, and she recognized what she felt. She felt genuinely met. Not managed, not performed at, not handled. Met. She opened her laptop and began outlining the collaboration proposal. Over the next 6 weeks, the professional relationship developed with the kind of clean momentum that good work creates when two people are both fully engaged. They met 3 more times in formal settings, twice at his firm, once at a neutral location, and they exchanged detailed written feedback on early strategy drafts. Marcus was thorough. He read everything she sent him carefully and responded with the same care. He did not waste words and he did not waste her time, which she had come to understand was its own form of respect. Laura, who had watched this professional collaboration develop from a distance, asked Naomi over dinner one evening whether there was anything more than business happening. Naomi said no. Then she paused and said she was not entirely sure. Then she picked up her fork and said she was focusing on the work. Laura smiled and said nothing and refilled Naomi's glass. What Naomi had not told Laura, what she had not told anyone, was that Marcus had done something in their 4th meeting that had quietly shifted something in her. They had been reviewing a final section of the brand strategy document when she had made an offhand comment about a previous career decision she had stepped back from, said it lightly, in passing, the way you mention things you have already made peace with. Marcus had looked at her for a moment and then said it sounded like something worth returning to. Not as advice. Not as a suggestion that she had made a mistake. Just as an observation, offered simply, as if it were obvious that her ambitions were worth taking seriously. She had looked at him across the conference table and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She had felt seen. Not evaluated, not assessed, not found adequate. Seen. She went home that evening and stood in her kitchen for a long time without turning on the lights, thinking about the difference between someone who admires you and someone who actually perceives you, who sees the edges of you, the parts that are not performing, the parts that are just real. She had not thought she was ready for anything. She had told herself she was in a season of building, of reclaiming her own life, and that there was no room yet for anything else. But the thing about genuine connection is that it does not wait for a convenient moment. It arrives when it arrives, and you either acknowledge it or you spend a long time pretending it is not there. Naomi Carter did not have much patience left for pretending. On a Friday afternoon, after the 5th and final collaboration meeting, the one where the strategy had been signed off and the formal work was technically complete, Marcus Webb stood with her in the elevator lobby and said, with the same directness he brought to everything, that he had genuinely enjoyed working with her, and that he hoped it was not the last professional conversation they had. Then he paused, briefly, and said he also hoped it was not the last personal conversation they had. He said it clearly. Without drama. Without making her responsible for managing his feelings or figuring out what he meant. She looked at him and thought about all the ways she had been made to feel that her own clarity was too much, that her directness was abrasive, that the straightforwardness she had always valued in herself made people uncomfortable. Then she looked at this man who had just said exactly what he meant and waited for her response without trying to shape what it would be. She said she would like that too. The elevator arrived. They both had somewhere to be. But walking to her car, Naomi felt something she recognized from a long time ago, the very beginning of something, the moment before a story picks up speed. She did not let herself think about Derek. She was done spending energy on what she had left behind. She looked ahead, at the city street in the late afternoon light, and thought about the person she was becoming, the work she was doing, the life she was building. And she let herself, for the first time in a long time, feel genuinely curious about what came next. It started with a phone call on a Sunday morning in November. Naomi was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a book she was only half reading when her phone lit up with Marcus's name. They had spoken twice since the elevator conversation, brief, professional exchanges about loose ends on the collaboration. And both times she had noticed the way the conversation extended slightly past the point where the professional reason for calling had been resolved, neither of them quite ready to end it. She answered on the second ring. He asked if she had plans for the afternoon. He said there was a talk at the Design Museum about brand identity in architecture, and he thought she might find it interesting, and he was going either way, but he would prefer company, and specifically her company. It was that specifically her company that she remembered afterward. Not a casual invitation thrown outward in the hope that someone would catch it. A specific, deliberate choice. She said yes. They spent 4 hours together that Sunday. The talk lasted an hour, and then they walked without any particular destination through the neighborhoods surrounding the museum, and the conversation never ran dry. Never hit those moments of constructed politeness where two people are filling silence rather than creating something. It moved naturally, from work to ideas to the particular details of their own lives, the kind of details that you only offer when you feel safe enough to be honest. She learned that he had spent most of his 20s working in London, that he had come back to the city because his mother had been ill, and that he had never quite expected to stay as long as he had. She learned that he ran early in the mornings not because he was disciplined about exercise but because it was the one part of his day that belonged entirely to him. She learned that he cooked badly but enthusiastically, that he had once attempted a dinner party that had ended with ordering takeaway, and that he had found the whole thing funny rather than embarrassing. She told him about the job she had turned down 18 months ago. Not the surface version she had been telling people, the one where she had made a thoughtful decision to stay, but the honest version, where she had been quietly convinced that her relationship required her sacrifice and she had made it without fully admitting to herself what she was giving up. He listened. He did not try to reframe it or make it feel better. He said it sounded like it had cost her something real, and that it took a particular kind of strength to name that clearly. She had not been expecting that. She had been half expecting either judgment or the over-reassuring warmth of someone who did not want her to feel bad. What she got was acknowledgement without sentiment, which was rarer and more nourishing than either of the alternatives. They stopped at a coffee place near the park at the end of the afternoon and sat across from each other at a small table by the window. The light had turned to that particular late afternoon shade, gold and slightly tired, and the city outside moved at its Sunday pace. Marcus looked at her across the table and said, without any particular lead-up, that he wanted to be honest about something. He said that the interest he had in spending time with her was not ambiguous, and that he was not someone who enjoyed ambiguity, and so he wanted to be clear. He said he understood she had been through something difficult recently, and that he had no intention of making her feel pressured about anything, and that he simply wanted her to know where he stood. Naomi sat with that for a moment. Then she said she appreciated the honesty. She said she was not someone who needed to be protected from clarity. She said that she was in a place in her life where she was very intentional about what she allowed in, and that she meant that as information rather than caution, she was telling him who she was, not warning him off. He smiled. It was a different kind of smile than she was used to seeing from him, less controlled, more actual. He said that was good to know. They stayed at that table for another hour. What followed was not a whirlwind. It was not a dramatic sweep of emotion that knocked the wind out of her. It was something she came to value more than that. It was gradual and honest, and it grew at a pace that allowed her to remain entirely herself throughout it. They saw each other twice the following week, once for dinner and once for a walk that turned into a 2-hour conversation on a bench in the park. He sent her an article about something they had discussed on Sunday. She sent him back a response that was longer than she had intended and did not edit it down, which was its own small thing. She had stopped making her thoughts shorter to seem less intense. He responded with equal length and equal engagement. By the 3rd week of November, they were spending most of their free evenings together. It was not dramatic or declared. It was just the natural gravity of two people who found that the time spent with each other was more interesting than the time spent apart. Laura met Marcus for the first time over dinner in early December. She was characteristically observant and characteristically quiet about what she observed until she and Naomi were alone afterward. Then she said, with great precision, that he looked at Naomi the way people should look at someone they are with, as though the person was actually there and actually mattered, not as though she were a backdrop to something else. Naomi said she had noticed that too. She had been paying attention to it in the particular way you pay attention to something you are still a little afraid to trust. She had been watching for the signs she had learned to miss, the small withdrawals, the moments of being turned away from, the subtle deprioritizations that built up over time like sediment. She was not watching from fear. She was watching from knowledge. She had earned the right to be an accurate reader of her own experience. What she kept finding, instead of warning signs, was consistency. Marcus was the same person in private that he was in professional settings, no performance for one audience and a different reality for another. He was the same at 10 in the morning in a meeting room as he was at 11 at night sitting on her couch with his shoes off. He said what he thought and he thought before he said it, and he did not use warmth as a tool for getting something. He was, she realized, the kind of person she had theoretically believed existed but had stopped fully expecting to encounter. There was an evening in mid-December when they were cooking in her kitchen, badly, in his case, with great effort, and they had ended up laughing at the state of the pan, and he had looked at her mid-laugh with that unguarded expression she was beginning to know, and she had felt something settle inside her. Not the anxious, high-alert feeling of early romance. Not the performed happiness of being seen to be happy. Just the quiet certainty of being in the right place at the right time with the right person. It was nothing like what she had felt with Derek. With Derek, she had been in a constant low-level negotiation, for attention, for recognition, for the feeling that her presence in the relationship was something valued rather than assumed. With Marcus, there was no negotiation. There was just the simple, straightforward experience of being treated as someone whose time and thoughts and presence were genuinely wanted. She had not realized how tired the negotiation had made her until she no longer had to do it. The news reached Derek in the way these things do, through the overlapping edges of shared professional worlds. A mutual acquaintance mentioned seeing Naomi and Marcus Webb at a restaurant together. Someone else mentioned it at a networking event. By the time the information had traveled its natural route, Derek knew, and anyone paying attention to him knew that he knew. He did not reach out to Naomi about it. She gave him credit for that. She gave him no more than that, but she gave him that. What she heard, through Laura, through the ambient information of a shared professional community, was that he had not taken it quietly inside himself. He was not visibly falling apart, he was too careful for that, but there was something clipped about him in meetings, something that people who knew him well could detect. The particular discomfort of a man who had traded something valuable for something shiny and was beginning to understand exactly what the exchange had cost him. Naomi did not take satisfaction in this. She had moved too far from that space. What she felt, when she thought about it at all, was something closer to a weary compassion, the kind you feel for someone who has made an error in judgment that they cannot undo. She hoped he would learn from it. She felt nothing else in particular. Her life was too full to spend time measuring herself against what she had left. She was 3 months into the brand director role and already being asked to lead a major campaign that would define the firm's positioning for the next 5 years. Her relationship with Marcus was quiet and real and growing. Her friendships, the ones she had let thin during the years of the relationship, were being rebuilt with the honest energy of 2 people meeting again after time apart and finding they still recognized each other. She was sleeping well. She was cooking what she wanted to cook. She was making decisions from a place of genuine choice rather than the careful management of someone else's preferences. She had not known how heavy it was until she put it down. By January, Naomi Carter and Marcus Webb had stopped being a quiet fact and had become something their respective professional worlds had simply absorbed and moved on from, which is what happens when 2 capable, grounded people choose each other without making it anyone else's business. There were no announcements. There were no public moments designed for observers. There was just a woman and a man who were genuinely choosing each other, day after day, in the ordinary and important ways that real relationships are actually built. Marcus had a daughter. Her name was Lily, and she was 7 years old, and she lived primarily with Marcus's former partner, a woman named Diane, with whom he had ended things 4 years prior. Naomi had known about Lily from early in their relationship, mentioned in passing, never hidden, always part of the factual landscape of who Marcus was. She had not yet met the child, which was appropriate. Marcus was deliberate about that, careful in the specific way that good parents are careful, not making introductions until there was genuine stability and intention behind them. But she knew the shape of his life. She knew that Tuesday evenings were his designated time with Lily, and that he was fully present on those evenings in a way that he described simply as the most important thing. She knew that he had photos of Lily on his desk at work and on his phone, not in a curated way but in the honest, slightly overpopulated way of a parent who photographs everything and deletes nothing. She found this deeply good. Not as a performance of virtue, not as a checkbox. Just genuinely, quietly good. February arrived cold and clear, and with it, a shift in the landscape that no one had quite predicted. Derek Hale's firm lost a contract. Not a minor one, a flagship client account that had been the anchor of their portfolio for 6 years. The account went to Marcus Webb's firm, which was not a coincidence but was also not the specific drama it appeared to be from the outside. Marcus had been building toward that pitch for 8 months, long before Naomi had entered his professional life, and the win was earned on its own terms. But the optics, as optics tend to do, told their own story. In the overlap of their shared professional world, where Derek's personal and professional situation were now both visibly altered, the pattern was hard to miss. The woman he had let go was now with the man who was outperforming him in the one arena he had always defined himself by. Naomi heard about the lost account through an industry newsletter on a Wednesday morning. She read the article once, acknowledged the information, and moved on to her own work. She was preparing for a strategy presentation that afternoon and had no attention to spare for Derek's professional trajectory. What she could not have anticipated was the conversation that followed. That same Wednesday afternoon, Derek Hale called her directly for the first time in 4 months. She did not answer. He left a voicemail. She listened to it once. His voice was controlled but with something underneath it that she recognized, the particular tension of a man who has arrived at a moment of reckoning and is reaching for the nearest familiar thing. He said he had been thinking about the choices he had made. He said he had been thinking about her. He said he was not calling to make things difficult, and that he hoped she was well, and that he would be grateful if she called back. She listened to the voicemail twice. Then she set her phone face down on her desk and returned to her presentation. She did not call him back. Not because she was being unkind, but because the conversation he wanted to have existed in a version of her life that she no longer lived. She had nothing to offer him, not forgiveness to withhold, not anger to express, not the kind of closure that required her presence to be achieved. Whatever he needed to work through, he needed to work through it elsewhere. She mentioned the voicemail to Marcus that evening. She told him not to make it dramatic, just to be transparent, because she had decided that transparency was going to be the foundation she built things on. Marcus listened. He did not make it about himself. He said he was glad she had told him, and he asked once if she was all right, and when she said yes, genuinely yes, he nodded and said okay, and they made dinner and talked about other things. She thought about that moment afterward. The simplicity of it. The way he had held the information without turning it into something larger than it was. She had learned, from experience, that the measure of a person is not how they behave when things are easy but how they respond when something complicated enters the room. Marcus had responded with steadiness. She had come to understand that steadiness as the quiet form of strength she most respected. In March, she met Lily for the first time. It happened the way Marcus had described it would happen, not as an occasion, but organically, when the timing felt right and the relationship had the kind of stability that made the introduction something natural rather than something formal. They met on a Saturday afternoon at a children's exhibition at the Science Museum, where Lily had already been engaged with 3 separate interactive displays by the time Naomi arrived. Lily was 7 and completely self-possessed, with her father's careful eyes and a way of asking questions that went directly to the point. She asked Naomi what her job was. When Naomi explained, Lily considered this and said that sounded like a job for someone who thought a lot. Naomi said yes, that was pretty much right. Lily nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to the exhibition. On the way out of the museum, Lily took Naomi's hand at a crosswalk without any ceremony, simply because it was a crosswalk and hands were available, and Naomi felt something she had not expected, a warmth that was entirely uncomplicated, and an awareness that the life she was building had textures she had not predicted and could not have designed. She told Laura about the museum visit over the phone that evening, and Laura said nothing for a moment and then said, "Oh, Naomi," in the soft, private voice of a friend who is happy for you in the particular way that makes no sound. April arrived and with it the first genuine test of what they had built. Marcus was offered a position at a firm in another city, a significant professional expansion, the kind of offer that a person in his position could not dismiss without serious thought. He told Naomi about it the same evening he received it. He did not treat her as someone who needed to be protected from the information, or as someone whose reaction he needed to manage. He told her directly, including all the details, and then he said he wanted her perspective. Not because her perspective would make the decision for him, but because she was a person he respected and because her life was now genuinely entangled with his and he believed that was worth acknowledging out loud. She asked him what he wanted. Not what the opportunity offered, not what the professional logic suggested. What he actually wanted. He thought for a moment. Then he said that what he had built here, professionally, personally, with Lily, with her, was something he did not want to dismantle for a title. He said the opportunity was significant, but that what was significant to him had shifted, and he knew that clearly enough to trust it. She looked at him and said she thought that was a wise thing to know about yourself. He turned down the offer. She never told him what to do. He made the decision from the clarity of someone who had done the internal work of knowing what he valued, and that was its own kind of answer. Summer arrived warm and unhurried. Naomi's campaign launched in June to strong reception. Marcus's firm closed 2 more major accounts. Lily had a school play in which she was, by her own modest account, the best horse in the entire production, a claim that she delivered with such complete sincerity that it required no fact-checking. On a Friday evening in late July, Naomi and Marcus were sitting on her balcony as the city cooled from the heat of the day, and she was reading and he was doing nothing in particular, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not require filling, that is itself a form of companionship. She put her book down and looked at the city. She thought about the corridor of that hotel. The midnight car to the airport. The suitcase she had packed with steady hands while her life fell apart around her. She thought about the woman who had sat in the departure lounge and made herself one quiet promise. She had kept it. She had not gone back to being smaller. She had not traded one reduction for another. She had taken herself seriously, her work, her time, her own feelings, and she had let that seriousness lead her to exactly the kind of life she had quietly believed she deserved but had stopped expecting to find. Marcus said her name softly. She looked at him. He said he had been meaning to say something for a while, and that he had been thinking about how to say it well, and that he had decided the best approach was to just say it clearly. He said he loved her. He said it the way he said everything, directly, without managing her response in advance, without softening it into something more manageable. Just the truth of it, offered plainly, in the warm evening air. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about how differently a sentence could land depending on what you had learned to hear it through. She had heard similar words before in a different life, and they had meant something contingent, something she had to keep earning. These words did not feel that way. These words had the weight of someone who meant them in full, without conditions attached. She said she loved him too. He smiled. She smiled. The city went on below them in its evening business, entirely indifferent to the quiet, complete, absolutely ordinary beauty of what had just happened on that balcony. They sat there until the lights came on across the skyline. She had never been more at home in her own life. She had never felt more like herself, not the managed version, not the reduced version, not the woman who kept herself small to keep the peace. Herself, entirely. With her ambitions and her clarity and her capacity for love that was, it turned out, considerable once it was no longer being poured into soil that would not hold it. She had not walked away from Derek Hale to find Marcus Webb. She had walked away for herself, for the woman she knew she was and had been teaching herself to disbelieve in. Marcus had not rescued her from anything. She had done that. He had simply shown up in the life she had built for herself, and he had belonged in it in a way that was unmistakable and uncomplicated. Some stories end with a return to what was. This was not that kind of story. This was the kind where the leaving is not the ending but the beginning, where the hardest moment is also the truest turning point, where a woman picks up her own life with both hands in the middle of the night and simply decides to carry it differently from then on. Naomi Carter had made that decision in a hotel room in the mountains, with a half-packed suitcase and the lights of a parking lot below her window and nobody there to see it. It had been enough. It had been everything.